Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this event with Professor Jeffrey Weidlinger, who will discuss his recent book, In the Midst of Civilized Europe, the Pogroms of 1918-1921, and the Onset of the Holocaust. I'm Geneviève Zobrzitsky. I'm director of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, and I'll be moderating today's event with my colleague, Professor Scott Spector, who's acting director of the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies here at the U of M. The event today is jointly sponsored by WCEE and the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies, and is also co-sponsored by CREASE, the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. And this is WCEE's last event of the semester and the calendar year. And we're thrilled to have so many of you with us today. We have 95 participants joining us from the US, Canada, and Europe. So we're really excited about this event, this conversation with Professor Weidlinger on his most recent book. I will give some information before Scott Spector introduces Jeff Weidlinger, and we will shortly post information about the book in the chat. And we ask participants to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to submit questions to Jeff Weidlinger. We will collect the questions toward the end, but you can pose a question at any time during the event. So the format for today is after we introduce our speaker, Professor Weidlinger will be talking about the book for about 20 minutes. Then we have a conversation, the three of us, and then we open up to the floor. So we really encourage you to pose questions about the book and about Professor Weidlinger's work. And we look forward to the conversation. And so now I will pass it to Scott Spector, who will introduce Jeff Weidlinger.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Scott Spector. I have the honor today of introducing my friend and colleague, Jeffrey Weidlinger, who's Joseph Brodsky Collegiate Professor of History and Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. Jeff came to us from the University of Indiana, where he made his early career from assistant to associate full, and then named professorial chair, and where he served as director of the Jewish Studies program there from 2009 to 2013. So we hired him here in 2013, and very soon after, from 2015 to 2021, he served as director of our Gina and Samuel Frankel Center for Judaic Studies, the center I'm currently directing. Professor Weidlinger is the author of not only this wonderful book that we're discussing today, In the Midst of Civilized Europe, the Pogroms of 1918 to 1921 and the Onset of the Holocaust, but also other award-winning books, In the Shadow of the Shtetl, Small Town Jewish Life in Soviet Ukraine, Jewish Public Culture in the Late Russian Empire, and the Moscow State Jewish Theater, Jewish Culture on the Soviet Stage. And he's received prizes for each of these books from various agencies. He's prominent in the national and international fields of Jewish history and Holocaust studies. And for instance, he's the chair of the Academic Advisory Council of the Center for Jewish History, member of the Executive Committee of the American Academy for Jewish Research, and a member of the Academic Committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and former vice president of the Association for Jewish Studies. So he's really widely recognized and supported by grants, fellowships, prizes. He's incredibly prominent. We're very proud to have him here. And without further ado, let me turn the floor over to him for a short presentation before our discussion. Jeff?
Scott, thank you. Thank you, Scott, and thanks, Geneviève, and thank you to WCE and to the Frankel Center and to CREASE, and I think that was most of the sponsors, so thanks to all of you. And Scott, very nice to see you sitting there. I recognize that background from having sat there for 6 years myself. Now I'm back in the history department where I'm sitting, giving this little talk. So I thought that what I would do today in the 20 minutes or so that I have to speak is talk a little bit about the book and a little bit about how I got interested in this topic and how I turned to this topic. And in order to do that, I think I'm going to show a little bit of slides and share my screen, and hopefully this will work out. And see how things go. So you should be seeing now my screen. Do you in fact see my screen? Yeah, okay. So there you have the cover of the book that came out just about 6 weeks ago, maybe a little bit less. And took me about 7 years or so to write. I started writing it as soon as I became director of the Frankel Center. Didn't know I was going to be directing the Frankel Center, so I thought I'd have all this time to write a book, and was hoping it would take me a little bit less time, but it took me about 7 years to write it. And I became interested in the topic of the pogroms of 1918 to 1921, largely when I was working on a project interviewing elderly Yiddish speakers throughout Ukraine about their life experiences. And I would travel every summer with a group of people, and we would find the oldest people who spoke Yiddish in a town that we could find. We would interview them about their life experiences. And I was traveling with some linguists. The project was led by my colleague Dovber Kurler, was my colleague then at Indiana University, and he was interested in the linguistics of what they were saying, and I was interested in the oral histories and how they were telling their stories. And I was struck by the way they spoke about the Holocaust and the way they spoke about the violence before it. And it really struck me as different than the way I was accustomed to hearing about the Holocaust. I myself am the son of a Holocaust survivor. There you see a picture of my father in their apartment in Budapest in 1944. You can see my father with his parents and a neighbor, and that's on the balcony of their apartment. They survived the war by hiding out in the basement of that apartment, by running out of a lineup and hiding out in the basement of the apartment. And my father had always told me how completely unexpected, unimaginable the Holocaust was. And he talked about his childhood before the Holocaust, living really a conventional middle-class childhood. He would go on family vacations to Lake Balaton where they had a cottage, and he would go skiing in the Alps occasionally. He took fencing lessons. He was a star student. You know, life was very normal for him until suddenly it wasn't. And that's kind of the conventional way that the Holocaust is portrayed to us. And it's because this is the way the Holocaust did in fact take place, predominantly in Western and Central Europe. It came seemingly out of the blue. You know, the two most common portrayals of the Holocaust that we have, the two most prominent memoirs, are those of Anne Frank and Elie Wiesel. And for both of them, it came about suddenly as well. Both of them were coming from middle class, lower middle class families that suddenly in 1942 or 1933 suddenly took a turn. And before that, the type of violence that they were going to experience was completely unexpected. You know, there's a Holocaust Memorial Center not too far from here in Farmington Hills, Michigan, that portrays the Holocaust that way as well, as a sudden turn. You enter this big room, and there's all of these displays of Jewish life before the war. You have displays of Jewish newspapers and Jewish political parties and Jewish sports organizations and religious life, and it's a big open space. And then you turn a corner, and there's a narrow hallway that goes down, and at the very end of that narrow hallway is a big portrait of Hitler. And that gives the impression that suddenly things changed, that you turned a corner and suddenly everything changed. And what I realized is interviewing elderly Jewish speakers in Ukraine, which happens to be the place where the very first mass murders of Jews in the Holocaust took place, the violence that they encountered as part of the Holocaust was really part of a known ritual. They already had experiences of troops coming into the town and massacring the Jewish population. And this is what got me interested in the topic. So I want to actually show you really this map first that shows about 500 locations between 1918 and 1921 in which about 100,000 Jews were killed in in about 1,000 or between 1,000 and 2,000 separate incidents. Some towns had multiple incidents. And most of these pogroms left maybe only a dozen, I shouldn't say only, but left about a dozen people dead. Some of them, the worst of them, left over 1,000 people dead, and sometimes perhaps even 3,000. We don't know the total numbers of victims of these pogroms, but most historians would agree they are over 100,000. Some would say that it's up to even 300,000 Jews were killed. Another 600,000 or so were turned into refugees and fled the region entirely. Others became orphans. Widows became destitute, lost their entire stores, lost their houses, had their synagogues burned down. There were instances in which soldiers marched into towns and completely massacred the entire town. Sometimes they would round up the Jews in the center of square, take them to the outskirts of town near the train station, and kill them. And in at least one case, the entire Jewish population of the town was forced into the synagogue, and the synagogue was burned down to the ground. And the thing about these pogroms that, in fact, may even make them different from some other pogroms is that they were perpetrated by so many different types of people as different militaries and different regimes came and went during this period, sometimes known as the Russian Civil War. They were killed the pogroms were perpetrated by Ukrainian peasants, Polish townsfolk, Russian soldiers, sometimes by their neighbors, and sometimes by military units that came in. And Jews were killed for a wide variety of reasons. The Bolsheviks targeted the Jews because they associated them with bourgeois nationalists. The business people, the so-called bourgeois nationalists, targeted the Jews because they associated them with the Bolsheviks. The Poles targeted the Jews because they thought they were loyal to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians thought the Jews were loyal to the Poles. The Russians assumed that the Jews were in league with the Germans and so targeted them, and the Germans assumed that the Jews were in league with the Russians. So basically, in this vast civil war of all of these different militaries fighting each other and different people fighting each other, regardless of whose side you were on, there was a Jew to blame. And for that reason, the Jews were targeted by all of the sides of the conflict. And I want to show you a couple clips of interviews that we conducted in Ukraine with survivors of these pogroms. The first of them is a fellow by the name of Nisan Yurkovetsky, and he survived the pogrom in Tulchin in 1919. Yurkovetsky at the time was an infant, and he was being held by his mother as his mother was murdered, along with the rest of his family. And he'll show us, he'll lift up his arm and show us a scar across his arm where the bullet that killed his mother grazed his arm while she was holding him. He survived because, he survived, and then a few hours later, a Polish priest wandered by and saw that he was alive in the mass grave, and so rescued him and brought him back to life. And so I'm going to play you the clip of him talking about it. It's in Yiddish, but there are subtitles, so you can hear what he's saying.
Schickert geht mein Futter. Schicken 19 Jahren gereinigt. Ein Futter mit einem Meter aus dem Draget.
In 19 Jahren, das gewinnt in ganzen 2 Jahren.
Oh,
Wer hat sich da angebracht?
Bandeljachowitsch, hat geschossen, der Bandit. Ist der geflogen, der Pulle. Hat es, hat Semen. Und da kriegt sie Porach. Wieder.
Ja, aber das schon, ja.
Hat man hintergenommen. Apolik. Apolik hat man hintergenommen. Dus als ik in de actions afnugel. En dat nog haar aangenemen. En wat daar gerottet, wat er geschollen werd. Had draagt bij mij af voeten. Wenn bij mij heb ik maar af voeten. Och, ze doen bij mij heb ik maar af voeten. En een meter. in a Seide, a Schnader,
Wie hat er mit gegessen?
Gickel.
Beide sind gewähnt von dort, von
Schicke, ja.
Schickes von Dulcin. Und
We don't hear you, Jeff. No. Yeah, now we hear you.
I hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
You're able to hear the video? You're able to hear the video okay, though? Okay. All right. So anyway, the interesting thing about the pogrom that Yurkovetsky describes is it was perpetrated by his neighbors in a small town. He knows the name of the gang. It was perpetrated by a local gang that was going around town to town, perpetrating atrocities against the Jews. And these pogroms took a wide variety of forms. Some of them were of that nature. And in fact, the vast majority of them, actually, the largest number of them, were perpetrated by neighbors. And these are people, mostly young people, who were 14, 15, 16 at the time, and had grown up in a period of war. Their parents, instead of farming the land, had been out fighting wars. They hadn't had they hadn't had harvests for the last several years because of World War I and the Civil War. And really all the children knew was war. And they're starving. So they go into town and they plunder the Jewish town. They plunder the shops and they plunder they plunder the liquor stores and they plunder whatever the Jews have. And they regard this as requisitions. They regard it as getting food to feed themselves, but the Jews perceive it as a pogrom. In this case, in the case of Tulchin, they also committed atrocities. They rounded up Jewish families and killed them, massacring them in mass graves, like the one that Yurkovetsky describes. So that's the form that really the largest number of pogroms during this period took place. But there were also pogroms that were perpetrated by military units. So I'm going to play you another video in which a fellow, Naum Geiviker, describes the pogrom that took place in Proskurov. Proskurov was where the largest pogrom that we know of took place. It was on February 15th, 1919, perpetrated by the Ukrainian military. And this was possibly the largest massacre of Jews in Jewish history up until that point in time. Somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 Jews were killed over a period of 4 hours by Ukrainian soldiers who went door to door, rounding up Jews and killing them. In this case, he himself doesn't tell the story. He's rather elderly, but his wife tells the story as he sits by listening. So I'm going to share my screen again and let you hear this story.
Also gewesen 6 Jahre ist gewesen der Pogrome gewesen. Und der Groß, was hat gewohnt so mit Jiden.
Wie gegessen die Goss?
Saborn hat gegessen der Groß. Besant ist
Das
das
ist am Zentrum, ja, das ist ein Zenterstuhl.
Da wie der Market ist das da bei uns. Wer hat sich kein Boten, hat sich geboten, aber wir sind gefahren, ja, Jidene. Da. Da Tote Sana mit der Eltern, mit der kleineren Schwester, und später auf zu gehen auf den Boden, und hat sich dort geboten. Mit der Matschach ist gestanden hinten. Und der ganze Goss hat nun Argen in die Jiden. Man muss nun Argen in die Jiden. Und wir sagen zu seinen Stiebern, gibt Gold oder belohnt gibt. Und sie sind gewinnt stark kuren, so haben gar nicht gut, so haben wir haben gar nicht. Ob die Gäste gar nicht, wenn man die aufnimmt im Kopf. Na, wo hat er getan in Drößen, haben sie nicht gewusst, aber ich meine, sie haben nur gehört, aber geschrien gewollt hat, geschrien. In der Zeit hat nun gegeben zu pfeifen. Wir sollen sich separeien, die Natscheißwe, soll sich separeien. Und genommen der Bandit, das hat sich gewollt erargenen, und hat genommen der Schaschgesannen, hat angelegt im Futlar und ist rausgegangen. In der Zeit sind sie geblieben leben. Nur wenn sie rausgegangen in Drößen, haben sie gesehen, du liegen Käpp, du liegen End, du liegen Fies, und alle seine Chavere haben neu gearbeitet. Und ist mit der Matschach geblieben leben. Trotzdem alle Jungen haben sich gemischt, alle Jungen.
In nur dem seinen Arm der Paljaken, was sie genommen dem Toten, auf anderem Geduschen, als eine Gewehen, wir haben gemeint, mit dem gearbeitet, mit dem hat sie genommen, in der Welt, so gesogen, die Ambasure, die haben, wopschem sie gewehen, freilich du. Ich habe überlebt, die...
Trotzdem alle, was sie getroffen hat, haben selber gelebt.
Okay, so you get the point. In this one, he's describing a completely different type of pogrom, one perpetrated by a military. The interesting thing is this pogrom was perpetrated in February 1919. The Ukrainian state was less than 3 months old. Directions, the unit that perpetrated the pogrom in Praskurov was acting without authority from the central government. And the central government didn't even know what its army was doing. This was an army that had just been formed. So you hear him talking about how they went door to door. And then a few months later, there was yet another pogrom in the same city, this time perpetrated by the Polish army. So you can also see multiple units coming in and committing atrocities against the Jews in town as they arrive. You can also see from both of them the continued trauma that this violence has 70 years later. She's saying it tormented him his entire life. Yurkovetsky has literally a physical sign of the trauma in the example of the Tulchin pogrom across his arm. So you can imagine what the trauma of this violence was a mere 20 years later. The violence took place 1918 to 1921, and it was 1941 when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. And when they invaded, they were entering this killing ground in which the legacy of immense violence from only 20 years old was still playing out. It had just been 20 years. I just want to say a couple more things before I end my initial comments here. And one is that, I wondered why I didn't really recognize the extent of this violence until recently. And I was wondering if people were talking about it in between the wars. Why didn't I know about this? Why wasn't this talked about as one of the causes of the Holocaust? And I'm not saying it's the only cause of the Holocaust, but certainly the fact that there was this type of violence en masse only 20 years before the first mass killings of the Holocaust began in the very same towns in which the first mass killings of the Holocaust began seemed to me to be relevant. So I was looking to see what people were saying in the interwar period. And you can see, you can see that in some of the most prominent of places, they were talking about these pogroms. This is from the New York Times in September 1919. You can see the headline is Ukrainian Jews aim to stop pogroms. And then mass meeting hears that 127,000 Jews have been killed and 6 million are in peril. And this article from September 1919 concludes with the sentence, this fact that the population of 6 million souls in Ukraine and in Poland have received notice through action and by word that they are going to be completely exterminated. This fact stands before the whole world as the paramount issue of the present day. September 8th, 1919, saying that the coming extermination, the complete extermination of 6 million souls in Ukraine and Poland is the most pressing issue of the present day. And in fact, it wasn't just the New York Times that was predicting a massacre of the Jewish population in Ukraine and Poland in 1919. This is a special issue of the Literary Digest, or an ad for the special issue called "Will a Slaughter of Jews Be Next European Horror?" Here we have a report from the Russian Red Cross saying the task that the pogrom movement set itself was to rid Ukraine of all Jews and to carry it out in many cases by the wholesale physical extermination of the race. Emma Goldman, who traveled to Ukraine, wrote about the wholesale slaughter of the Jews, and the French writer Anatole France wrote that the pogroms threatened the Jews with complete extinction. And here we have the quote that the title of my book comes from. In the very midst of civilized Europe, at the dawn of a new era, he wrote, the existence of a whole population is threatened. And here we have a 1921 issue of the Nation that's entitled "The Murder of a Race," as though it is searching for the term genocide that had not yet been invented. So
can I ask you,
yeah.
Were you meaning to show us slides?
Or it's not showing you slides?
No.
Okay, I was meaning to show you slides.
We're still on the image of the screen, the YouTube clip.
Okay, well, let me...
I mean, you read them, so I wasn't sure.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I read them anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But I will show you I'm just going to show you the New York Times one. I'll just switch back and try to show you the New York Times one. And then actually I'm ending my brief presentation anyway. Let's see. Do you see slides now? Okay. So this is the New York Times one. Again, mass meaning here is that 127,000 Jews have been killed and 6 million are in peril. And again, I'll just read you the last line of it because I think it's so dramatic. The fact the population of 6 million souls in Ukraine and Poland have received notice through action by word that they're going to be completely exterminated stands before the whole world as the paramount issue of the present day. And then here's the other ones. This is the Literary Digest ad. And then there are the quotes that I read, and here's the Nation ad. So sorry that those weren't sharing. I'm going to stop sharing now anyway and go back to me and just comment that when I started to delve into this more, I saw that in the interwar period, really, the pogroms were all anybody was talking about. Jewish art was portraying the pogroms. Jewish literature was talking about the pogroms, and all warning that there was a coming slaughter that was about to occur. And it presents an alternative view from the view that my father had given me, for instance, and that we get in most Holocaust textbooks, as well as in Holocaust museums, that the Holocaust started suddenly, that it came about as a sudden turn with the ascension of Hitler to the chancellorship of Germany. But when we look at what was going on in Ukraine even before Stalin, this is not just the Bloodlands argument, but I'm predating it to before Stalin. We can see that the murder of Jews was already an accepted response to the excesses of Bolshevism. People, regardless of political stripes, still regarded the murder of Jews as a natural response to their problems. And there had been revenges worked out over time. There were still many of the problems that had brought about the pogroms still remained in 1941. Tension between the city and the countryside, political tension, Bolshevism, all of these remained relevant in 1941 and were factors in the Holocaust and in the killing of Jews, which again took place in these regions only 20 years after this other realm of mass violence. So that's basically what the book is about and goes into detail on the pogroms. And with that, I'll end my little brief presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I mean, it's chilling material, and to see also the visuals. I mean, it's a unusual archive also that you could, you're talking to survivors, you're meeting with them, and you're hearing them speak in Yiddish, telling them their stories. And then you also have like documentary evidence that you're dealing with. So I think we'll talk about this, but first I want to go back to the last 2 minutes of your presentation, because your argument then is for, implies a reconsideration of what the Holocaust was about. and the reperiodization, you could argue that it starts with these pogroms and then it ends perhaps in 1947 or 48 with the quote unquote, the last pogroms that were happening also in the region, even after the end of World War II. So can you talk to us about this? I mean, the implications for how we think about the causes of the Holocaust, the disjuncture also that you see between what was going on east by the territories directly impacted by the Russian Revolution versus those that were not, and what it means for historiography and how we think about also how unique the Holocaust is, if we think that the Holocaust is unique because it was a machine, because it was planned, because if you think that pogroms are actually a prequel or is a form of reaction to the Russian Revolution and the violence and anti-Semitism that occurred at the time. So, I mean, I guess I'm asking you like 12 questions in one, but it'd be useful to have you reflect on, what this book is actually, how it reopens the debate about what the Holocaust was, why it occurred, and when it actually began and ended.
Right. So those are, excellent questions that I really try to get out of the book. The first is what the Holocaust was. And many of us think of the Holocaust solely as Auschwitz and the death camps. And that is a leap from what I'm talking about. But the Holocaust, I mean, a lot of scholarship recently has brought more attention to the way the Holocaust took place in the East. And about 1.5 million Jews were killed in the East before the major death camps even began functioning. Some of them were functioning, but before they really began functioning at full capacity. And that scholarship has brought our attention to the unbureaucratized nature of the Holocaust. Hannah Arendt portrays it as totalitarianism, as people being reduced to nothing, as the banality of evil, right? As though it was completely mechanized and bureaucratized and people had very little input in what they were doing. Generations of Holocaust studies since Hannah Arendt have shown us that, in fact, people were making choices on multiple levels and weren't acting just as cogs in a machine. And we see that particularly in the East, where the killings were much more close at hand, where neighbors were killing neighbors, and where many of the killings actually resembled pogroms. And in fact, the people that we interviewed in Ukraine referred to the killings of the Holocaust as pogroms. They used the same word that they used to describe the violence of 1918 to 1921. So Holocaust research itself has made us realize that at least in July 1941, the first killings that began the Holocaust really looked a lot like the killings of 1918 to 1921. The most prominent is the pogrom in Lviv in 1941, which resembled in many ways the pogrom in Lviv in 1918, in November 1918, that began the wave of pogroms that I write about. So that type of research makes us recognize the similarities. At the same time, research on the pogroms of 1918 to 21 make us realize that not all of those pogroms were locals ransacking stores, but some of them were also perpetrated by military units going town to town, rounding up Jews and killing them. So those pogroms also, as we study them more, seem to resemble some of the violence of the Holocaust as well. They were also military. They weren't just local race riots. So those two, they start to converge. And the historiography, the research on them shows that they're more similar than we had imagined at the beginning. As far as the periodization is concerned, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum periodizes the Holocaust as beginning in 1933 and ending in 1945. So if you think of what was going on in 1933 in Germany, the exclusion of Jews from German public life, that is a huge leap to Auschwitz. But yet somehow that's called the Holocaust, yet rounding up 1,500 Jews in a city and murdering them over the course of 4 hours is a completely different thing. So if we're going to talk about legal restrictions on Jews from public life as part of the Holocaust, it seems to me that we can also talk about the mass murder of Jews as part of the Holocaust or part of that same process. And of course, if we look at the terms that the victims themselves were using, they called, in Yiddish, they called what I'm talking about, the 1918 to 1921 period, a churban, which is the Yiddish word for destruction. And churban is also the same term that they used to describe the Holocaust. So for them, for the victims, the two are, seem much more similar. And this is what I noticed when we were interviewing people as well, is that in their memory, it's massacre after massacre. And does it really make a difference to them, to Nisan Yurkovetsky? Does it make a difference that his mother was murdered by locals in the pogroms in 1918 to 1921, whereas his cousins were murdered by the Germans in 1941? It's all part of the same phenomenon. When a military moves in, when there's political change, the Jews get blamed and the Jews get killed. So I think that changes the periodization. And then just to talk about the causal effect for a minute, there's a few things that I think helped prepare the ground for the Holocaust in relationship to the pogroms. The first is simply making the unimaginable imaginable. The massacre of Jews seemed unimaginable until it started to happen. And when the Germans invaded Ukraine, they realized their utopian dream of killing Jews could actually be implemented. That's the first time that they see that it's actually possible to do what maybe they had imagined in their utopian dreams. So that's one impact. Another impact is the pogroms led to a massive wave of refugees, and the largest recipient of refugees was Germany. And all of these poverty-stricken Jewish refugees were arriving in Germany in the early 1920s, and they were being blamed for importing Bolshevism. Even though they were fleeing Bolshevism, they were blamed for importing Bolshevism to Germany. And this led to the rise of, or at least contributed to the rise of right-wing movements in Germany. And in fact, the Nazi Party in its early days was focused on the importation of Bolshevism by Eastern European Jews. They talked about it extensively, and this helped gain them supporters by people who were really joining the Nazis to fight against this wave of Jewish refugees from pogroms. And then another cause is in Ukraine itself, Jews joined the Bolsheviks because the Bolsheviks at a certain point in time started cracking down on pogroms, and the Red Army cracked down on pogroms. So Jews would join the Red Army in order to fight the pogroms. And this led to a snowball effect where Jews were blamed for being Bolsheviks. And as a result, the Bolsheviks supported the Jews and more Jews joined the Bolsheviks. And it just snowballs. So Jews became closely associated with the Bolsheviks. In 1921 to 1923 particularly, there was a wave of tribunals, Soviet tribunals, that prosecuted pogrom perpetrators. And for the Jews, this was a good thing, that the pogrom perpetrators were actually being punished. And Jews joined the Soviet secret police in order to prosecute the pogrom perpetrators. And what that meant is that many of the pogrom perpetrators were killed. And as I said, they were often young Ukrainian men from the villages. And so to those villages, it looked like the Jews coming in with their tribunals and killing the leaders of our town. They're killing the local toughs, who were also the local leadership. So this furthered animosities between Jews and Ukrainians in Ukraine, where the Jews were associated with the Cheka, with the Soviet secret police, who were killing pogrom perpetrators. And in fact, the Cheka got its start in Ukraine by prosecuting pogrom perpetrators. They called it the war on banditry, but bandits was another word for pogrom perpetrators. They were pretty much the same thing. And then many of the people who the Germans brought in as auxiliary police in 1941 were people who had experienced during the Civil War. These were people who had been 14, 15 during the Civil War, had often been involved in atrocities against Jews, and now volunteered to serve as the German auxiliary police in 1941. So in at least a few cases that I've managed to document, it's literally the same people who are serving as auxiliary police who had been pogrom perpetrators 20 years earlier.
You've covered so much territory already that I keep changing my mind about which question to ask, because the larger questions about continuity, contiguity, sort of the big historical questions about how to place this in relation to Holocaust is something I think we should come back to. But where you've now turned led to a different question that I think you haven't really gone into a lot yet. And this has to do with just the question of anti-Semitism. And one of the reasons that I ask it is because, you teach a major course on anti-Semitism for us here in the unit. You're a kind of an expert on it. And I wonder about how studies of anti-Semitism or debates about anti-Semitism could help us understand the events that unfold in the book. I mean, it makes its appearance, almost peripherally, I have to say. There is this, like, around the figure of Trotsky or the general association of the Jews with Bolshevism. There's propaganda, anti-Semitic propaganda is definitely presented in the book. But in terms of a motivating factor, you don't really analyze anti-Semitism as a phenomenon, or as I see, really use it as a kind of explanatory category, do you? And it has been in the literature. And so I wondered, what role would you say anti-Semitism played in these histories? And if it did play a role, what kind of anti-Semitism was it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I try not to use the word anti-Semitism in the book, although it comes up a few times, mainly because I think it confuses more than it explains. It encompasses too much different phenomenon and is thought of differently by different people. So certainly any time Jews are rounded up and killed, that's anti-Semitic, right, in a way, even if it doesn't draw on traditional anti-Semitic motifs. So the question really, when you're asking if it's anti-Semitism, is whether, or to what extent it's anti-Semitism, is to what extent it draws on traditional anti-Semitic motifs, whatever those may be. And the answer is that some anti-Semitic motifs are employed, but I don't think they're really the driving force. To give some concrete examples, the main motivation of the pogroms is killing Jews because they're associated with Bolshevism. Why are Jews associated with Bolshevism? On one hand, they're associated with Bolshevism because they do join the Bolsheviks. But even before that, there's a reason they're associated with Bolshevism, and that's that Bolshevism is promising the peasants land, bread, and peace. Those are good things. And if you are a member of the whites, if you are a conservative reactionary, or even a liberal for that matter, and you want to rouse the peasantry against what the Bolsheviks are promising, it's very hard to rouse them against land, bread, and peace. So what you do is you say this whole thing, these whole promises of land, bread, and peace, they're not real. Really, they're just a trick of the Jews. And that they understand. For people who are, less ideologically sophisticated, that's something they can understand, that the Jews are trying to trick us. So anti-Semitism in that case is employed, or really old Jewish motifs are employed by those who are trying to rouse the peasantry against the Jews as a way of gaining their support. The accusation that the Jews are coming and they're going to take away your churches, that also plays upon an old motif that the Jews are holding the keys to the churches, for instance. And so that plays well with the peasants. The Jews are coming and taking your land. That plays well because there are these preconceptions. There's an affective disposition to think of the Jews in certain ways, and they can play upon it. The reasons, so that's how anti-Semitism plays into this, is by using those traditional motifs, traditional ways of regarding the Jews. Another, by the way, is that the Jews are rich. The Jews are hoarding wealth. And so when people are starving and in desperate need of food, it makes sense to go rob the Jews. And by the way, a way that you can tell that it's motivated by anti-Jewish sentiment as opposed to just pure anti-Bolshevism is when these militaries invade a town on the grounds of combating Bolshevism, the first thing they do is they rob the houses of the wealthy. They go to the wealthy estates that are often Jewish owned, and they rob them. And if you're really combating Bolshevism, the people least likely to be sympathetic to the Bolsheviks are those living in the wealthy estates. Yet they are the ones who are attacked first in any campaign against Bolshevism. So it's, that's evidence that is motivated as well by anti-Jewish hatred, not just by anti-Bolshevik hatred. Okay, go ahead, Scott. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, arguing from the completely different direction, in breaking open the sort of the uniqueness, insulation of the Holocaust from other periods, and even in a way geographically, does interestingly remind you of things that are going on in Holocaust studies from completely different quarters, and that is the continuities to colonial violence, the efforts that many scholars and students describe as decolonizing the Holocaust, sort of opening it up to looking at other genocides that enabled it, and also that the discourse on the Holocaust it enables discussion of, Dirk Moses and the German Catechism is this very recent kind of debate, but I was thinking more about Michael Rothberg's multidimensional memory, which has been a very controversial intervention in German history. A lot of these are coming from quarters of the German history of the Holocaust, or at least, even to the degree that it's international, looking more from the perspective of National Socialism as the agent, which is obviously not what you're doing. But I wonder about the connection between the ways that you're trying to break open that, or open up those continuities, and these other kinds of attempts that move outside of, the Jewish population of Europe altogether.
One of the connections is all of them are attempts to look at other explanations for the Holocaust instead of just one, instead of looking at it solely through the perspective of racism and anti-Semitism that we've usually seen it through the rise of the Nazis and particularities of the Nazi Party, is to look at other causations. And that's not to say that the Nazi Party is not a major cause of the Holocaust, if not the major cause, but it's just they're all looking at other explanations, whether it's colonialism or whether it's a history of violence in the region. I do think all of those play a part, and I agree with much of Dirk Moses's catechism. This, however, there is something specific about the Jews. There are other groups that are targeted during the Civil War in Russia, but none are targeted quite as extensively by all sides. And none of them come to symbolize evil so much as the Jews. And if you look at white propaganda, there is an obsession with the Jews that's mirrored by the Nazis. In fact, Nazi propaganda in 1941 to 42 is focused so much on the accusation that Jews are Bolshevism, or the Jews are Bolsheviks. And I think that's also an aspect of the Holocaust that we forget, that the focus on the experience in Western Central Europe, where Bolshevism didn't play into Nazi propaganda so much, this new perspective shows us the importance of that element. If you look at, so the German propaganda posters from 1941 could just as easily have been white posters from 1919. And I use a few in my book, one that shows Trotsky leading Jesus to the crucifix, for instance. And that's a perfect example of how a modern anti-Bolshevism is merged with ancient Jew hatred, or with traditional Jew hatred, what maybe we would call anti-Semitism. How those motifs are employed against the Bolsheviks.
because we're talking about this, I'm just gonna, there's two questions I think that really address or touch on issues you're just discussing. One is from Twyla Tardif and the other one from Brian Porter-Schutz. So Twyla is asking, you know, why you start then in 1918 and not go prior. So that relates to this issue of both periodization, but also to this issue of more sociopolitical, right? I mean, because your analysis of pogroms is a sociological one, actually, analyzing, you know, what's going on and why the Jews actually become the enemies of different social political groups. So why not, you know, 1905 or late 1800s in Ukraine? And then Brian is, you know, concerned that the contrast you make between the early violence in Eastern Europe versus the relative peace in Central and Western Europe is basically, you know, a form of Orientalism that ossifies these kind of visions of East versus West. But now when you're talking about, you know, you were making these links between even iconography, anti-Jewish iconography in both East and West. You know, could you address these issues?
Well, to Brian's point, I think he's exactly right, that it is contingent. I don't think there's some innate difference between East and West or between Poland and Ukraine by any means. It's purely contingent about the way the war was fought and the way and the reach of the Bolsheviks, really. I think had there been successful Bolshevik revolutions, as Trotsky imagined that there would be in Germany as well, then Germany there would have been similar tendencies in Germany as there were in Ukraine. So I think so much of it is motivated by anti-Bolshevism and just the accusation that Jews are Bolsheviks is a way of merging them together. So I completely agree with Brian's point. To the periodization, yeah, so I could have started in 1905 or 1881, in which there are also waves of pogroms. To me, the difference is precisely the prominence of the Bolsheviks as a motif in 1918 to 1921, and again as a motif in 1941. It's also the warring parties and the impact of the First World War that comes into play. So I do think that there is a distinction between the types of pogroms that begin in November 1918 precisely, which is when German and Austrian troops retreat from Ukraine. There's a difference between that type of pogrom, between the motivation of the pogrom and the severity of the pogrom. There's a difference between that and the ones that take place between 1903 and 1906, say. But that being said, it is noteworthy that they tend to come in waves about every 20 years. And that's a generational wave. And each wave gets worse. The 1881 to 1882 pogroms resulted in the deaths of a couple dozen Jews throughout Ukraine. The 1903 to 1906 pogroms resulted in the deaths of between 3,000 to 6,000 Jews. The 1918 to 1921 pogroms resulted in the death of about 100,000 Jews, and then 1941 is much more. So every 20 years, there seems to be this generational wave of violence against Jews, all tied to socio-economic things happening and to military actions taking place. But each time the unconceivable becomes more conceivable. It gets easier each time, would be another way of putting it. Once the ice has been broken, it's easier to kill the next time. And by the way, many genocides are preceded by mini genocides 20 years before. The Armenian genocide is preceded by the Hamidian massacres. The Rwandan genocide was preceded by extensive violence, mostly in Burundi in the 1970s. So it's often the case that the children of one genocide as they become, or the children of one spate of ethnic violence as they become adults, commit larger spates of ethnic violence or genocides against the same groups 20 years later.
This is clearly, you know, one of the insights that you brought to us in the book, and today it became clear to me because of the way that you presented your inspiration through this ethnography and the clips that you showed us, and the argument that people actually use the same kind of language. And this is connected to the questions we were asking earlier. That is, it's not only, the question of conceivability, but the question of, a language to represent such an experience, a way to understand such an experience. And you're showing continuity there, but there's also some kind of hiccups, and also in the questions, I'm seeing that as well. Like, Louis Siegelbaum points out this thing about the cliche or the trope that East European Jews thought that the Germans would be more civilized. And so maybe your research actually supports the idea that they would have felt more secure about invading Germans in light of what had happened to them earlier. I hope, Louis, that I've represented what you've asked right. I didn't quote you. And others are also asking about the connection between what's happened in Eastern Europe, about these pogroms, whether Nazi leaders knew about it, whether they were imitating these or taking a cue from those, or whether there were distinctions. Would you have an answer for that group of questions?
Yeah, I mean, there's some different questions in there, but they're good questions. First of all, the Nazi leadership absolutely knew about them. And they, in the local commanders' instructions, they referenced the pogroms of 1918 to 1921. And the first one, that one in Lviv in July 1941, the Germans even named Petlura days, using the name of Simon Petlura, who was the head of the Ukrainian state during this period. So the Nazis very deliberately connected to the pogroms. Then in reference to Lewis's question, which is really a great question about the Germans, it also really, part of what I'm arguing is nationality didn't make that big a difference, that all groups perpetrated atrocities against Jews. The reason, I would say, that the Germans in the period of 1914, we'll say, through 1919, didn't commit as many atrocities was simply because of the time in which they were there. I think if the Germans were also participating in 1919 to 1921, at which point the violence against Jews had escalated, they probably would have participated equally too, for some reason or other. So I don't think national origins makes a difference in these pogroms. It's really a European-wide phenomenon of attributing the problems that ails one to the Jews. And the Ukrainians do it, the Poles do it, the Russians do it, the Romanians do it, and people of all political stripes do it, except after a certain point, except for the Bolsheviks, who crack down on it. And some would say, by the way, it's because the Bolsheviks are run by Jews. They would say that that's why the Bolsheviks are the ones cracking down on it. And I should point out that certainly the most visible representatives of Bolshevik power did have Jewish backgrounds, particularly Trotsky. And Trotsky becomes the symbol of the entire Soviet regime, even more so than Lenin. Lenin, who's mostly staying in Petrograd during this period, and Trotsky is representing the Bolshevik government to the West. He's heading the military. He is much more a representative of Soviet power, as well as Kamenev, by the way, Trotsky's Trotsky's brother-in-law, who is also prominent among the Bolsheviks and is also one of the major representatives to the West, and is also in Ukraine leading military units.
I want to go back to the interview work that you did, and the language that they use, that the subjects were using to describe the earlier pogroms with the experience of the Holocaust. And I was wondering, if that was the language and the metaphors that they use in Yiddish, if they were, and if you had a chance to speak to them in Russian or Ukrainian to see if they were using different language there, because the Jewish language itself might be using the Jewish, have words that characterize a specifically Jewish experience. But then the national languages make distinctions that are more, the history is different, is periodized, and also politically different. So in Polish, for example, I mean, they didn't use Holocaust until very recently. They used the word genocide, and the genocide of Poles and of Jews and of Roma, etc. So I mean, I think that the words that different groups use in different languages, and since the subjects you interviewed were also fluent in Ukrainian and perhaps Russian too, that'd be interesting to think about this. And actually, Henry Greenspan also had a question related to this, about the kinds of analogies people used for previous pogroms and then the Holocaust, that were having the same roots but different. So he's giving an example of a tree with the limbs cut off that Jewish Poles would be using to describe earlier pogroms, but the Holocaust is that the tree was completely, uprooted and cut down. So I wonder if you could reflect on these issues of language.
Yeah, so let me start with Henry Greenspan's question. I think the argument that anti-Semitism pre-existed in Poland as well is also, of course, true as it existed anywhere. But I'm really focusing on the violence more than just the anti-Semitism, more than just the beliefs, more than the superstitions about Jews or prejudices about Jews. I'm focusing on the specific acts of violence and ways in which that violence was carried out. And basically, I think violence begets more violence. Again, as I said earlier, it gets easier with each wave and becomes more possible with each wave. It really becomes a thing, as we would say, in modern parlance, where we talk about something becoming a thing. So violence against Jews becomes a thing that is understood as a response to different problems. As far as the language, it's a good question. I'm not sure, because we did our interviews in Yiddish, and I'd have to think about it. My gut reaction is that in Polish and Ukrainian, the term pogrom is still used in reference to massacres against Jews in 1941, certainly more than it is in English or German. So I think that's the answer. I'd have to really think about it a little bit more and go back and look, but I think it's still the same term.
Because but pogrom and genocide is different, right? So there's something that's, pogrom is a punctual event, right, that happens and it repeats, etc. But genocide has a different connotation to that. Yeah. So it'd be interesting to also see at what point, if any, pogroms come to be understood as genocidal action.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the 1918 to 1921 isn't usually seen as genocidal, although, again, the term doesn't exist at the time. So I don't know, it's talked about as the murder of a race in that, Nation article, which to me is pretty much genocide, but they don't have the term to use. The extermination of an entire race, we hear, the extermination of an entire people repeatedly used. The term genocide, I think, is problematic because of when it's established and how it's used. And, it's used pretty indiscriminately and imprecisely all the time. So it's hard to talk about genocidal violence because of that, because of the complexities of the term. Yeah.
I didn't want to overlook an early question, an excellent one from my colleague, Carla Goldman, who asks, points out that at the very time the pogroms were happening and there was a awareness in the US, she says you're sharing, of what was happening during this time. I don't know if you want to qualify that. She is pointing out that it's also the era when immigration of these populations to the US was cut off by the Immigration Restriction Acts So what do you make of that confluence?
Yeah, so I think it's not coincidental that, as I said earlier in reference to Germany in particular, there was a wave of refugees, hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees fleeing the pogrom-stricken area, and there was a fear that they were importing Bolshevism with them. This applied to Germany. It also applied to Poland. Many hundreds of thousands of Jews went through Poland, and then many of them eventually went to Germany. Also to Romania, Jews fled to Romania, and Jews fled to the United States. And between 1919 and 1923, there was also a Red Scare in all of these places in which Jews were blamed for importing Bolshevism. And we had that in the United States as well. Henry Ford, for instance, wrote about it, or his people wrote about it extensively in the Dearborn Independent, and worried about the influx of Jews bringing Bolshevism with them from Russia. As a result, in 1923 in particular, almost all of those countries restricted immigration of Jews. Poland kicked out all Jews who had immigrated before 1919, except those who had been returning to Poland and those who hadn't, those who had found some permanent domicile. Romania also kicked out Jews on the grounds that they were importing Bolshevism. Bavaria kicked out Jews on the grounds that they were importing Bolshevism. And other countries to which Jews were migrating as well instituted new restrictions on Jewish migrations. So the National Origins Act here in the United States in 1924 was also motivated in part by a desire to prevent the spread of Bolshevism to the United States through these Jewish migrants. So I think there's a very direct connection.
Genevieve, your mic is off, so I thought you were going to introduce another question.
I'm just.
I mean, I'll bring one from Owen. You know, Owen Johnson asks about the historiography in the Soviet Union, whether Soviet historians wrote about 1918 through 21 as it concerned Jews, and then he added on, have Russian or Ukrainian historians studied it since 1991? So just a question about the different national historiographies and maybe their ideological contexts.
Yeah, so great question again, and nice to see you, Owen. Well, I guess I'm not really seeing you, but nice to be in contact with you, Owen. So yes, quite a lot actually. And Elisa Bemporad, a colleague of mine, has a great book on the legacy of pogroms in the Soviet Union. They were talked about extensively. There were museum exhibitions on pogroms. There were volumes that were published about pogroms all through the 1920s. And the Soviet government liked to portray themselves as the people who stopped pogroms. And they portrayed pogroms as a legacy of Tsarism, as evidence of backwardness. They actively engaged in propaganda to prevent pogroms from happening again. The Soviet government in the 1920s really spent a lot of effort on educating the population about the dangers of anti-Semitism and the dangers of pogroms, because the last thing they wanted was that type of unbridled violence that they can't control, and particularly violence against Jews. So it was talked about extensively in the 1920s. And yes, since 1991, there have been several good books on pogroms, most notably by my colleague Oleg Budnitsky in Moscow, has written a great book, Between Reds and Whites, about pogroms in the Russian Civil War as well. And there's some others as well. There's a great collection of documents about the pogroms published in Russian. And in Ukraine, there's also been some work done on them.
Well, this sort of raises the question. I mean, there's Ryan Blackney has asked about whether the emigration of Jews from Ukraine and Russia to Germany in the interwar period contributed to the stab in the back myth. But, you know, I think that a lot of these questions that have come in that are also this one by Leo Franks about the spread from locality to locality, or was it somehow normalized by the non-military pogrom? Was it normalized? I mean, I think that a lot of people are trying to get a sense of what the real contribution of the book is vis-a-vis the history of pogroms. That is to say, we have known for a long time about these events, and we've already talked about how you're connecting them differently to the Holocaust as one of your gestures, but I think, you know, it would be fair to give you a chance to talk about what your contribution, what the contribution of this account has been. Is it, you know, has it been uncovering unknown material or connecting material to different other histories, or is it a novel interpretation of the events and the role of different actors?
Yeah, I think it's all of those, I would argue. And you know, the best way to find out is to read
Slam. Yeah.
the best way to find out is to read the book yourself, which I presume you have. But for those who are still listening, I would urge you to read the book and see. But what I'm trying to do is to put it all together. It's true that the pogroms have been written about quite extensively in the 1920s and 30s. They've been written about a lot less since then because they have been overwhelmed by the Holocaust. And what I'm trying to do is to apply some of the methodologies that we have developed in studying the Holocaust to the pogroms, to understand the intimacy of violence and the way it's portrayed, or the way it's played out as intimate violence between neighbors, to try to understand the carnivalesque aspect of the violence, the public ways in which violence is enacted, the way scripts are written and recreated, the ritualized nature of that violence, and the motivations for the violence as well. And we can use the book is based predominantly on tens of thousands of testimonies that were collected, on victim testimonies that were collected. And I take several different representative pogroms and try to deconstruct them to see exactly what's happening, who's at play, who precisely the perpetrators are. Not only are they Poles, but which military unit are they coming from, and why are they fighting? Why are they there? Why are they located there? What's the history of that town? So instead of looking at it all as one phenomenon, the period of pogroms, to look at it also to see the trees as well as the forest. But the techniques that I'm using, I think, or at least I hope, are techniques and methodologies that were developed in Holocaust historiography, because Holocaust historiography has been so vast and has taught us so much about the way violence plays out that we can apply that to a whole bunch of other instances. So that's what I'm trying to do in most of the book.
It's interesting that you mentioned the carnivalesque, you know, aspect of pogroms, and I'm thinking of the Jedwabne pogrom, in which Jewish men were forced to carry a statue of Lenin that had been installed there by the Soviet when they came to Poland, and they buried the Jews they killed. They buried the statue with them. So I mean, it's the carnivalesque, but also the symbolic politics and all of these rumors of Jews, you know, being Bolsheviks, etc., in like one extreme moment of violence of neighbor against neighbor. And that leads me perhaps to our last question, because we need to conclude now. Your book, I saw, is published already in Dutch, and I think it's coming out in German, Italian, and Spanish. Congratulations, that's fabulous. And I'm really curious about Russian, Ukrainian, and Polish translations.
So am I. If anybody knows how to get it published in Russian, Ukrainian, and Polish, let me know.
I mean,
I'd be happy to.
I think that this is very important for their historiographies and their own debates about the Holocaust and, you know, what preceded it and followed after.
I can see many reasons why they would not want it published in those languages, to be honest. But that's precisely the reasons that I hope it does get published in those languages.
Right. Well, thank you very much for meeting with us. We know you've had like a gazillion book talks, but ours was the best, huh, Scott?
Absolutely.
And congratulations on the book, the translation, and thank you again for being here. This was the last event of WCEE this semester. I think it's also the last for the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies, Scott. There might be another one.
We have
okay. The event, we had a question in the Q&A also. The event will be posted online on the CREASE, the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies website, YouTube channel, and also on the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia YouTube channel. It will probably be posted as well on the Franco Centers if you guys have a YouTube channel. So stay tuned, because I know some people who could not participate or who want family members to watch this event can do so in a couple days. Liz Melinkin just posted the link in the chat. So for those of you who are still there, you can click on it and be able to access it in a couple days. Thank you again.
I was going to also mention we have an event tomorrow on Thursday, December 9th, from 12 to 2, Queer Jews and Muslims, a roundtable on race, religion, gender, and sexuality. It's part of our series on the Jewish Muslim research network. And then we will, there's a conference on studies in Second Temple Judaism, a global enterprise in January 10th and 11th. So that is, of course, next semester. So you can just go to our website to register for that event tomorrow or for any of the events.
And this winter, the University of Michigan Musical Society, UMS, is showing also Fiddler on the Roof. I think it's February 18th and 19th, and we're building with Franco also programming around this. So we're going to have a roundtable on that musical and Yiddish, etc. We're going to have a roundtable also on refugee nest, the experience that's talked about in the play. And the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies will have an exhibit of Polish posters of Fiddler on the Roof here in Weiser Hall. So we invite everyone to come back to these events, and you'll be receiving emails about this. So thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Applause for Jeff.